it's time to rock with the biggity Buck Bumble. What about now, it's time to rock with the biggity Buck Bumble. Bum to the bump to the bump to the bass, bump to the bump to the bumble. Bump to the bump to the bump to the bass, bump to the bump to the bumble. Bump to the bump to the bump.
After having fallen in love with shooters all over again after playing Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as it was known here in England, I simply couldn't wait for Buck Bumble to be released in 1998. For months, magazines had been hyping it as potentially one of the best games which would be released on the console that year. In my mind, I still have the eternal sentence etched into my mind which was in a preview of the game. It said, "Think of all the coolest features of Lilac Wars and then take away the off-rails feel and you have Buck Bumble." The screenshots were all of action-packed scenes and some amazing angles which I couldn't wait to experience. But as the game's release began to slip and change almost on a monthly basis, I started to realise that something was definitely wrong. When I found out the game was coming out here just 2 weeks before Christmas, I instantly knew that it had been rushed to meet the Christmas sales period. But when I finally got my hands on the game, my feelings about it changed and have continued to change quite often ever since. The story of the game is actually a pretty cool one. After a toxic spill at a chemical factory in London, the insects of the surrounding area have begun to mutate and change, which resulted in new alliances forming to create an evil group known as the Herd. Their plan is to take over the whole garden and eventually the world, and in case you haven't guessed by now, you'll be playing as Buck Bumble, a bumblebee which gets implanted with cyborg technology from a group known as the Resistance, and he must go along to duke it out with the enemy and eventually the Queen Bee. And so begins 20 levels or so of 3D air battles, blasting everything that moves and generally causing chaos with the 15 weapons on offer. With the game being developed by Argonaut, I had high expectations of quality control going into the game. After all, they did a superb job with Star Fox on Super Nintendo, and so nothing could have prepared me for what a mixed bag this game actually was. In terms of gameplay, you have a third-person view of our hero in a fully polygonal 3D environment. Each mission has a different objective but usually involves either destroying a certain number of enemies or objects, with the occasional escort mission or time escape thrown in. The levels themselves are incredibly short, in the most part, and with the ability to save your game after every level, it makes Buck Bumble quite an easy game to complete. Once you have established what you need to do in each level, you can sometimes complete them in a matter of minutes, rushing through the level by bypassing all of the enemies to reach the goal. The lack of depth to the levels is also quite disappointing. The levels are usually quite small, enclosed environments, and it almost takes away the feel of actually having no restrictions on where you can fly. The range of enemies is however quite interesting, and there is a nice selection too. Some of the AI is very poor however, and instead of the intricate attack plans we were promised, what we were left with is a lot of enemies that will simply ram at you and fly right at you with no reactions to your oncoming fire. All of those issues can be forgiven however in the graphics department, as there is something quite unforgivable which almost brings the game to breaking point. In case you haven't noticed by now, the game is foggy beyond a reasonable level. Perhaps Argonaut tried to cover up the game's insane amount of fogging by saying that the game is based in London because heck, that's the easy option. But in all seriousness, it's hard to think of another N64 game which has this level of fog. The thick, murky green mist is everywhere, and it makes navigating even the smaller areas of the world tedious. You'll often lose track of where you are, and sometimes what seems like an empty area will suddenly become full of enemy fire as dozens of enemies appear from the mist like Jack the Ripper on a cold London night. Making matters worse is the subpar texture quality and frankly bland colour palette. Add these together and you have quite an ugly game. There are a few exceptions, such as the levels where you go underground like the sewer, and this is where the game feels most comfortable as the fogging is next to non-existent and the slowdown is also kept to a minimum. Now at the time, the game's controls were generally praised by most critics, but if you want to realise just how far analog controls have come, then you really need to play this. Buck Bumble's movement should have been a fluid blend of orchestrated manoeuvres and terrific acrobatics, but in reality the handling is terrible and is a million miles away from the tightness and balance that went into Star Fox. Buck moves quickly enough, but with the environments being so foggy and small, you'll often find yourself crashing into walls and objects. There are also numerous times that you'll need to fly through a small hole, but as soon as you get near any surface, Buck seems to land, which switches to the ground-based controls, and then you'll need to retake off into the air. It does allow for some cool attacks in places as you can perch yourself on ledges and shoot in all directions, but for the majority of the time this sticking mechanic hinders the game, and I wish they would have implemented a separate button to press to action landing, as the auto sticking mechanic just doesn't work here. The weapons are quite generic, and they're a mix of the usual lasers, machine guns and grenade style affairs, which serves a purpose, but it's a shame that the developers didn't think of anything more creative, especially given the insect theme of the game they were hoping for. What must have been tacked into the game at the last minute is the 2-player multiplayer mode, which is quite honestly one of the worst attempts at multiplayer I've seen on the console. There are 2 multiplayer modes, the first one being the bog standard deathmatch, which is near unplayable due to the graphics, environment, controls. The second mode is called Buzzball. Now Buzzball is a one-on-one football mode where the aim is to fire or push the ball into your opponent's goal. This mode is slightly more enjoyable, but that's almost like saying having a dental filling is more fun than root canal. Mario Kart 64 is definitely safe here as the multiplayer king. The game until this point you may think is quite an average game, which like many N64 games has its flawed and devised opinions. However, there is one thing about Buck Bumble that nobody will argue. Buck Bumble, quite simply, without any question whatsoever, without any shadow of a doubt, has the best and coolest video game theme song ever. Now garage music and drum and bass was quite big here in England in 1998, and in a touch of brilliance the entire game has that vibe running through it, and that begins from the very moment the title screen drop beats. I mean, come on, just listen to it. This will be stuck in your head for days on end, and within a few plays you'll be able to rap along with it word for word. The Donkey Kong 64 monkey rap is crap in comparison to this. But while you beatbox along to the epic theme, why not let me know your thoughts on Buck Bumble in the comments down below. Was this a day one pickup for you after you heard that Argonaut were making a 3D shooter, or were your plans to get it dashed when you saw some very mixed reviews for it from the gaming magazines of the time? As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and until next time,